it's me again. I think most of you know who I am by now. I'm Kim Conniff-Tabor. I'm the editorial director of the Democracy and Culture Foundation. I am honored to be able to lead this keynote panel discussion today with three very distinguished guests. The reason we decided to do a panel at lunchtime on making democracies more resilient is because this is the theme of the day, it's the theme of the week, it's the theme of, dare I say, the decade and even the century. So we wanted to get some experts' opinions on how we can do just that, people who've been out there in the trenches, and it's their life's work. So I also, before we kind of launch into the panel, I wanted to make a little connection to our morning sessions. So our building blocks projects, which you've heard plenty about this morning, that have now gone to 11 cities. They've involved near 500 people in roundtables and consultations. All of that couldn't have happened without the support and partnerships of other like-minded organizations like Atlas, Taijé Academy, New Democracy, corporations like Microsoft. The list is very long, so I won't mention them all here. But that's very much our model at the Democracy and Culture Foundation. We buttress our own networks and knowledge with the reach and the expertise of our partners from the private sector, the public sector, and civil society. So for this session, we have three experts in their fields, as I've said, or in several fields. In the case of actually all of them have had experience in several different fields. And so we want to know how they do it. How can the private, the public, and the civil sectors work together specifically with the goal of bolstering democracy, which, as we know, needs all the help it can get. So first, I would like to turn to Tom Brake. And just a little side note, we're going to be talking about public, private, et cetera partnerships, but also about just building coalitions and partnerships as a general principle. So Tom, who is now the director of Unlock Democracy, it's an organization that campaigns for democratic reforms in the UK. But he was also a Liberal Democrat MP for more than 20 years and a government minister in a coalition government of conservatives and Liberal Democrats. So I'm going to launch the same question to everyone, but then you can interpret it in your own way. What do you think are some of the first steps that are necessary in building coalitions that might help improve democracy? And if you could, wrap it in kind of a real-life example that actually had a positive outcome.
Thank you very much, Kim. So I think the first thing I'd like to do is just say that I'm hoping to demonstrate that all political careers don't end in failure by becoming director of Unlock Democracy, and I'm pleased that the organisation is growing. But in terms of building coalitions, I suppose the first thing is to work out whether the organisation that you are part of, whether everyone within that organisation is actually signed up to the idea that you are going to have a coalition with another organisation or other organisations. And the reason I say that is because the experience of my former party, the Liberal Democrats, working in coalition with the Conservatives was that whilst there was a very engaged process within the Liberal Democrats, which locked in Liberal Democrat members of Parliament, Liberal Democrat peers, and Liberal Democrat Party members to the idea there was going to be a coalition, the same process didn't happen within the Conservative Party. It was much more leadership-driven, which then led to very significant problems later on in the coalition where the larger coalition partner, the Conservatives, weren't able to abide by the rules that had been set out. So I think that is a starting point, just making sure that you as an organisation are fully subscribed to the idea of a coalition. And then there are lots of other things in terms of working in coalitions. Clearly, and this is more about the civil society sector now, that there are different organisations that have different remits and can do different things. So we are an organisation which, although we are apolitical, we do campaign very aggressively politically on the issues that we believe in, but we have to work with partners who are based in the charity sector, and we have to find ways of working with them because they can't be as out there as we are. So those are just a couple of points, I think, about coalitions.
Yeah, and I think we'll dig deeper into them, but the importance of adaptation, being able to adapt to the partners, but also And something we spoke briefly about at lunch was the importance of being able to compromise as well if you're trying to build a coalition, which you were touching on earlier. I'm going to turn next. I'm going to sort of go not necessarily in order here because I want to turn to Kate Chaney, who is a federal member of Parliament for Curtin in Western Australia. She's the region's first female independent federal MP in the House of Representatives, and she's also part of a movement that you may have heard about, the Teal movement of around, I think it's around 25, you can correct me if I'm wrong, independents that were elected about a year and a half ago, coming from outside politics to enact change. So I imagine that to get to that place, it certainly required some reliance on different groups to get you there, not just one sort of constituency. And you've also done many other things. You worked for an airport management company, so I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you brought sort of that experience of working in other sectors and also building coalitions to get to the point you are.
Thanks very much. So the community independent movement in Australia really came from the parties polarising and leaving a gap in the middle. And so communities like mine actually put up their own candidate and said, we don't want to choose from what's on offer. We want someone who represents our values. And part of that was building coalitions through what was known as the kitchen table conversations model, which is really working around kitchen tables in people's homes to talk about what is it that we care about, what are our values as a community. And there's a wonderful Margaret Wheatley quote, there's no power for change as great as a community discovering what it cares about. And so we saw that, and we saw, and I had nothing to do with politics 18 months ago, and was asked by this community group if I would run, and for 2 weeks thought I can't possibly do this, and ended up saying yes, and so had this amazing journey. But for me, what I learnt from that is asking questions is a big part of building coalitions, finding the things that you have in common, and then creating a positive vision for where that can take you, was probably what felt most novel about this movement, that it was very positive, very much based on an ability to believe that change was possible. And the 99.6% of Australians who are not a member of a major political party could actually put forward a candidate that they felt represented their values rather than choosing from what was on the menu.
And maybe just briefly, we'll get into it more later probably, but the fact that the system in Australia, because of the voting system which we referred to earlier, maybe you could just mention that a little bit, that may have allowed for that to happen, whereas in other countries, it may not have been possible.
Yeah, definitely. And certainly if you're looking at resilience in democracies, part of it is structural. And so in Australia, there's both compulsory voting and also preferential voting or ranked choice voting. So compulsory voting means everyone has to turn up, so you don't have the battle of actually getting people to turn up. It can have a moderating influence, and there's probably some question about that, but I think broadly you'd say that the parties end up closer to the middle as a result of having to appeal to everyone, not just those who are attracted to the extremes. And then preferential voting means you order the candidates in order of preference, so there's no such thing as a wasted vote. So if you take a chance and vote on a community candidate number one, if they're not in the final two, your vote will go to whoever you've put next in your list. So you know that your vote has contributed to the preferred candidate. And those two structural elements probably did make it more likely that this model could emerge. And it's not as many as 25. Of 151, there are 13 who are not aligned to a party now, but that's the biggest crossbench in the country's history.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially coming from, well, I live in France, but I was raised in the US, and coming from a US context, it's very different from the way things operate in the US, as you all know. Ginny, speaking of the US, yes. Fellow American, Ginny leads the Democracy Forward initiative at Microsoft, which I know you'll tell us about some of the specifics of what that does, but it's part of the corporate and social responsibility. Working against cyber threats, combating disinformation, and you also in the past have worked on tech, but to help political campaigns. So you've kind of been, straddling politics and tech for quite some time. So I want to put the same question to you, but maybe in a slightly different way. So some of the first steps you think are necessary in building coalitions, but specifically, what role does the business community have to play? And do you consider it an obligation or more of a responsibility? You said you get this question all the time. I know that you do, but I have to do my part and ask it.
No, absolutely. So I mean, in order to build coalitions around democracy, I think one fundamental thing is you have to agree on what you're trying to accomplish. You may have challenges in how you get there, and you may have differences of opinion, but you have to know what you're trying to accomplish. And I was really struck by a comment this morning from, I believe, a student who was talking about the importance of the elections actually being legitimate, right? If you don't have legitimate elections, then all these other reforms sound great, but in the end it's for nothing because your actual electoral process needs to be sound. But the tricky thing about having trust in elections is it can be undermined regardless of the truth. And so while I recognize that he was referencing some very legitimately rigged elections where the results were not accurate and did not represent the people, there are a lot of elections, including those in the US, that are actually run responsibly and have a responsible process, chain of custody, and are accurate results. And yet there are people who still do not trust them. And that's where sort of the other aspect of the work that we do comes in, which is this idea of the information ecosystem. And how do we have a place where we can have an open dialogue, share our opinions, not restrict speech, but also have an environment that's healthy. And what does that really depend on? That depends on an informed citizenry, which is why I love the sort of reference to resilience here, because we think a lot about resilience in the work we do as well, which is what is Microsoft's obligation or role when it comes to helping a more resilient society. One way that we think about it, we try and use sort of historical examples of where have we had success with these things in the past and how can we use that as a model for, again, our role and how we might be involved in the future. An example I'd like to use when we think about the information ecosystem is spam, because there was a moment where spam was everywhere and it felt like it was uncontrollable and it felt like it was something that none of us could really resolve. Now, some of you are too young to remember this. Many of you are going to be familiar with it. And so trust me if you're too young, spam was a real problem at one point. And people were sending money to princes and emptying their bank accounts when they thought that their neighbor was in trouble. And a lot of that was looking to be problematic and something that we would never resolve as a society. But through what I would say a sort of multi-stakeholder approach, which is what we're talking about here, the combination of government and private sector and civil society, we actually did kind of get our arms around it. It doesn't mean that spam doesn't exist anymore. No, of course it's still out there. But there were interventions in different places where each institution had a role to play. So for example, there were laws that were passed all over the world that said that certain behaviors were illegal. And if you enacted a certain behavior, you would be found liable. And so there was a government approach around policies that did create some sort of boundaries. There was, in the case of the private sector, there were technology solutions. We were able to figure out what was likely spam and put it into a spam inbox so that you were less likely to encounter it when you were engaged with your email. But there was also sort of a societal response piece to it, which was we all learned not to click that link unless we hovered over it first. And we all learned that the likelihood that my neighbor was asking for my money when I just saw them watering their yard a minute ago, and they're not abroad and needing this money, like that is a societal response. And there were a lot of people that contributed to that. Employees, I'm sure many of you who work at a company, you have to do trainings, probably you think too many of them, where you have to learn and you're taught by your employer what not to do because they're protecting their corporate assets, right? But there's also education campaigns in schools. So creating a resilient society around the information ecosystem is attainable, but it does require sort of this multi-stakeholder response where not one entity is responsible, but we all have intervention points. So that's an example of a coalition building, but I think it's one that we can also kind of go towards as we think about trust and we think about the information environment. To the responsibility or obligation question, maybe I sort of have answered it just by the fact that Microsoft has a team that is focused on democracy, and my My entire job is to think about Microsoft's role in how we support and protect democracies. But the question we often get is, why would you do that? What's the sales angle? How do you get more cloud consumption? You're selling to governments, aren't you? That's what people skeptically and understandably will ask. And there are a few good reasons for it, but I'll start with the business case because that's, I think, the most convincing. Democracy is good for business. Businesses thrive in an environment where innovation and rule of law are in place. And you can be innovative and you can trust the laws of a country in a democracy, in a stable democracy. And so that is important for us as a company. When we're looking where we want to place our investments, we do look to places where the rule of law is in place. And that is where we're most likely to put our biggest bets. Doesn't mean we don't engage in the rest of the world. Of course we do. We're a global company. We want to empower everyone on the planet to achieve more. But we do place probably our bigger bets in places where we know that there is a stable rule of law and where we're likely to have more benefit from it. And then there is, of course, the old adage, it's also the right thing to do. We do come from an angle of, it's sort of corporate social responsibility, though the team that I'm a part of is actually around how do we enhance and support people's fundamental rights. And so that includes some of my peers are focusing every day on human rights and what is Microsoft's role there, or accessibility, how do you make sure that people have access to technology regardless of disabilities. And so it's really about how do we ensure that our customers have access to technology and that we're doing our best to make that accessible to them.
Just to roll it back a little bit to the question of partnerships. There's the question of trust, I'm sure, that comes up when you, as a corporation, and people bringing up, okay, you're just trying to make money, et cetera. How do you get over that skepticism of people who just say, I don't want to trust, I don't want to build a partnership with you. I don't mean people, but organizations. We don't want to build a partnership with you. Why should we trust you? You're Microsoft, or put another tech company in that space.
Sure.
It may be even harder for some of the other ones.
Well, not everyone does. I mean, not everyone wants to partner with us all the time, and that's fine. What we do is we look for, again, the idea of a common goal. We look for civil society partners and governments who are trying to achieve something similar. And over time, I think trust is earned. Walking in with a check is not sufficient, right? Like, we have to walk in and show that we have receipts and we have the credentials.
In the process.
Yeah, so I think it's longevity and trust is built over time.
Tom has a comment to that.
I think in political terms, building trust is essential if you are trying to put together a coalition. And I reflect on the point in recent UK political history where a number of political parties, I think we reached 7 at one point, were campaigning for a people's vote or a second referendum in the country. And the reason that coalition worked is partly because of the very high degree of trust within the 7 political parties, because frankly, the views that some of the MPs in other parties were sharing about MPs in their own party, who had a different view on Brexit to them, had the traffic on the WhatsApp group that we were all part of, the 7 parties were part of, ever got out into the press, that would have been catastrophic. But the fact is that campaign ran for 18 months, and such was the degree of trust within the different political parties represented that information never leaked. Unfortunately, we didn't actually win the campaign, but that's another matter.
So, building, again, going back to the question of trust, but also there's going to be stumbling blocks. Inevitably, there are going to be fundamental disagreements, pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit. How do you get over those stumbling blocks when organizations just don't see eye to eye? This is to Tom or any of you, actually.
Well, I think you can, first of all, often I think a stumbling block is around the messaging that you're using. Where parties can't agree to it. And I think often what you need to settle that is to have some perhaps independent assessment of whether the messaging is being effective. And a very good example of that in the democracy sector is that whilst I think many organisations in civil society think that democracy in different parts of the world, in the UK, which I know best, is broken, that is not a message that we ever use because the public don't perceive it that way. The public perceive politics as being broken, not democracy. So making sure that we have the right messaging. But one other point, which is slightly off the question you've asked me, is really, and this came up in the earlier sessions, is how effective are we as coalitions in actually convincing the public that the democratic issues that we are campaigning on are significant. And unfortunately, I think often we fail what is probably the basic test.
And how do you bring the, I mean, do you have ideas or strategies? I mean, Kate, you've been very successful in bringing the public around, or maybe it's because it's the other way around. It's the public that came to you and the community who came to you and said, you know, we need people like you to join the fight and kind of change democracy from the inside out.
Yeah, I think definitely transparency and accountability are a big part of it. And there has been some outsider benefit too, in that, you know, I'm not there with a legacy to defend or decisions of a party that were made before my time that you then can't go against. So being in a position where you can go in and just say, this doesn't make any sense and communities deserve better on transparency and accountability, does build that trust and does, you know, then hold the major parties accountable. So we're finding that even though we don't hold the balance of power, this expanded crossbench of people who have generally all had success in other lives outside politics and are coming in as newcomers, are able to influence the conversation and say, this is not okay. And everyone who's in this game, who's been doing it like this forever, thinks it's okay, but people in the pub don't think this is okay. So I think raising that accountability and transparency has been a big part of building that trust. And you know, change happens at the speed of trust. And if you don't see that trust growing, nothing can happen. So bringing some fresh approaches to that, I think, has been useful in Australia.
I love the kitchen table metaphor. And I think all of us understand what that is as a concept, but I'm curious how it works in reality, kind of on the ground. And did those conversations, have they continued throughout this year and a half since you've been in office?
So the kitchen table conversation model was actually started 20 years ago in Australia and was used in the first independence campaign, Cathy McGowan, in a rural area. And then parts of it were used to progress through this recent wave of you know, greater independence. I mean, I spent a lot of time during the campaign in people's houses, talking to 20 of their friends and listening to them. What do you think matters? What do you care about? And that really informed, you know, my position. We've continued not so much in houses, but with different engagement tools. So I will do submissions on bits of legislation or inquiries that are built out of workshops that we've held, a bit like what we heard this morning on disability services or the Integrity Commission or housing or the wellbeing economy and what it is that we should be measuring about what matters to people. And so we're sort of crowdsourcing those, and it is two-way information sharing. Part of it is bringing people in and saying this is what's happening, and also trusting that there is wisdom in communities and there are the ideas there, and showing people that they can engage in the political process, that someone does listen to them, and that gets fed into an actual process, really builds that trust and builds that sense that democracy belongs to all of us. It isn't something that someone else has to deal with. You know, we have a responsibility for it.
And I think also the importance of realizing that going from kitchen table to kitchen table, it is a beautiful metaphor, but that's also only going to touch a very small percentage of the people, right? So there are also, you know, digital engagement mechanisms, and perhaps in the information space, I know that Microsoft has been working on disinformation and information campaign. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about how that fits into your work to make democracies more resilient through information and anti-disinformation.
Well, one thing that I thought I was thinking about as you were talking about kitchen tables and kitchen table issues, and you notice there are a couple of panels throughout today or through this week's sessions that are talking about AI. And what has changed? You know, in the session before, it was mentioned it's not like this is a new technology. It's not like threats about ethics and AI haven't come up before. Why is now a moment that we are all of a sudden talking about AI in this environment? And it's because people are using it. It's because consumers, everyday citizens, is a technology they can now understand and they can feel, and they're asking questions. And so there's really, truly something to be said about the power of the people, that when they start paying attention to something, it moves governments, it moves companies, and it moves conversations like the ones that we're having over the next few days. Just wait till people start learning about quantum. This conference will be all about quantum in several years, but right now it's about AI, and that's appropriate. I actually have hope when we think of challenges that are ahead of us. I have hope around coalition building that we'll get to a place where we actually do come up with some regulatory consensus around how we're going to regulate AI. And a large part of that speed of it actually coming about and people having this conversation now is because people care about it and they're asking questions. Now, are they asking about the regulatory environment? Maybe not directly, but they're asking questions about, well, what's going to happen if I get a phone call and it sounds like my grandchild, but I've heard that there's this technology out there that can manipulate and make it sound like my grandchild and it's not actually, and how am I going to know? So they care at a very personal level about what's going to happen. And that's where one of the things that we've been working on a lot has been, as we have seen deepfakes emerging. This is obviously a tech that we've known as possible, and many in this room have known as possible, and in fact exists for a long time. We spent a lot of time in Microsoft with our research teams focused on how can you build like a deepfake detector, because we were like, that's what we're all going to want at some point, is the ability to run a video through and say true or false. And that sounds great. What most of the researchers say is there are moments in time where you'll have a pretty strong detector. I think right now the detection is out ahead of the technology that's being used to deceive. But it will be an arms race, and we'll be consistently creating better technology to deceive, creating better detectors, on and on. And so you'll get to a point in the future where you just don't know where you are in that cycle. And because you don't know where you are in that cycle, you don't know if you can trust the detection mechanisms. So what Microsoft and Adobe and TruePic and a lot of a coalition of tech companies primarily, and some media, BBC and others joined us, we started thinking about what does it mean to look at the authenticity of an image or a video and where it originally came from. And can we maybe start from that point to build out trust and to see that it's been manipulated? And so there are these standards out there right now that anyone can apply called content provenance standards, which we have started applying as a company to all of the generative AI created videos and images that come off of our platform. So if you go to Bing Image Creator, which I know you all are doing on a constant basis, if you go to Bing Image Creator, which is partnered with DALL-E, and you ask for a visual of people sitting in a conference about democracy, and you get 4 little images, they're all going to have this cryptographically created watermark that's going to tell you that that was generated by generative AI. And if you attempt to take that image and move it somewhere else, it will stay with it throughout its life cycle. And so that way you'll always have that transparency. Now the next point, and then I'll stop talking, I promise. The next point is we need to get consumers aware of that and asking for it. There was conversation earlier on the building blocks panel about transparency and labeling. Transparency and labeling is great if people know to ask for the label or know what it means. And so we still have a lot of work to do from an education perspective, but this is one of those good news stories where there's actually some solutions in place. It's more of an education piece at this point.
I just wanted to ask Ginny whether there isn't a need, however, for the tech companies to perhaps put the brakes on, because the fact is that the regulators and governments are never going to be able to keep up to speed with what the sector is doing. And if the sector is releasing things before regulators have had a chance to say anything about it, then we're missing the boat. And a good example of that is in the UK, where the government are currently encouraging retailers to use face detection technology in stores to deal with shoplifting, where really the degree of control, the accuracy of the technology is not very good and could have severe consequences. So what role is the tech sector going to play in actually waiting for government and regulators to give them a chance to regulate some of the technology that is coming out?
I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I'm with you on the importance of regulation. And the approach we've taken, and a lot of other tech companies have as well, is fast education for lawmakers. This is different than I think what we've seen in the evolution of other technologies, where I think you saw less of an interest in going to the lawmakers and explaining the tech. we're also out there very publicly with recommendations and frameworks and open to conversations. Our boss, Brad Smith, who is president of Microsoft, testified in front of the Senate in the US last week on this, maybe 2 weeks ago, on this very issue. We are open to having these conversations. We're laying out frameworks. We will make adjustments as we see. The challenge about breaking and stopping is, first, it's very challenging to do that internationally, globally, right? And so we have to consider the scale and the pace at which others are developing this technology as well, and keep in mind that we want to have Western-aligned, similar values companies and countries who are leading on a lot of this technology. I think there's value in at least being on par. And so we probably don't want to put the restrictions on just one segment, knowing that other segments won't follow. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it responsibly and in coordination and conversation with governments and lawmakers, because we absolutely think that this should be regulated.
So I want to take it back a little bit to the partnerships element, but we only have a few minutes, so I want to see first, kind of canvass the room. Does anybody have a question for our esteemed panelists? Because we're going to have lots of time to talk about AI, ethics, et cetera, so maybe steer it in the other direction, more towards the partnerships, coalition building, et cetera. If there's any questions on that. And gentleman over here.
Brett's over there.
Oh, sorry. Was there somebody already has it? Sorry, go ahead.
In the wake of the insurrection on January 6th, a number of companies indicated, along with Microsoft, that they were pledging not to give any more political contributions to the 147 members of Congress at that time that had voted not to certify the election results. Increasingly, shareholders are imposing upon corporations these sorts of values that they want to see reflected in that corporate citizenship. I was wondering, from Microsoft's perspective, how far does the corporate values go when it comes time for actively supporting political candidates? And does Microsoft leverage any of its business connections to make certain that the people they do business with are also aligned with those values?
Yes, it's a great question, and you're right. After January 6th, our PAC, which is of course not, and I think this is helpful for a non-American audience who doesn't necessarily understand how the funding mechanisms work in the US, just quickly, we have a voluntary employee political action committee where employees who choose to can contribute to it. It's not corporate money that goes into the political system, but it is an interest of and supporting Microsoft's political perspective and needs. And so we do have funds that employees give voluntarily that we decided to no longer give to those who had voted against January 6th. And we do continue to get a lot of questions about where and how we further where and how we use our relationships with our vendors and our supporters to support things that we have said that we definitively have as a value. The first key is transparency. So we are, going back to the way that our PAC operates, when we make contributions to candidates, we have a series of principles as far as what it is that we are, why we are making contributions to any candidates, and then we show how this particular candidate aligns to that principle. We also have a committee of employees who can raise their hand and object if they think that one of the members that we are proposing giving funds to violates any of our other values that we've talked about, and we will review that. The PAC committee will review that and make a decision. And we're transparent with all of our employees, not just those who give to the PAC, about each and every single one of those gifts. So transparency is fundamental and important. We also work closely with our shareholders when they raise objections, and we'll go through a review process. I think the best example is when we've advocated. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Sorry. No,
we can
okay.
talk more about it outside.
But yes, we continue that outside.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off, but I just want to make sure that we have a chance for one more question, for maybe directed more towards either Kate or Tom, or a general that anybody from the panel could answer. This gentleman over here.
Yes, hello, Brett Hennig from the Sortition Foundation. I just wanted to push back a bit against the idea that every successful collaboration actually has an agreed goal at the end, because I think there's a very important example in the UK of the Democracy Network, where this Democracy Network saw that the democracy sector in the UK was very sort of divided, and came together and said, let's try to, we all agree on the problem. We all have a different solution that we promote, actually, but we can all agree on the problem. And I think what was more important was that they shared values. And so this organisation, this network came together, and Tom has mentioned some of the work that came out of that, where they, and we'll hear from Electoral Reform Society, funded some of this research. We all came together to start talking about the problems with democracy in the same kind of language, in the same kind of framing, and this important thing about talking about politics being broken and not democracy being broken. And you never mention random selection. You always say selection by lottery because it uploads different kinds of things to people's minds. And so that idea of actually talking in the same frame reinforces every group in that network's message. And we also found out if someone agrees with one reform message, they often agree with a second reform message. And so that collaboration across a shared values network was really, I think, a really successful example.
So it's not a question.
Not really, it's more a comment.
Okay,
Thanks.
okay, just making that clear. Okay, our time is up, but I do want to hear very quickly, I know there's one question in the back. We'll take it, but quickly. And then I want to hear, after this question, I want you guys to get ready and just one sentence point of one piece of advice that you would give to a politician, organization, whatever, wanting to build coalitions, but with this precise goal of, democratic resilience. So, question in the back. I think it's Namatai, if I can see correctly. I think we have a problem with the mic.
Okay. Thank you. So my question basically is about tech diplomacy, and particularly Afro-focused tech diplomacy. I think most of the times when we have conversations about tech and how it is changing and impacting the world, it's often had in the context of the global north and Western countries, and it's quite understandable. Most of the innovations are happening in this side of the world, but it is also affecting African societies. So my question to the panelists is, given the context of when we talk about regulation, we talk about policies and laws, there is actually a greater policy and regulation vacuum in African countries, where some of these platforms are also being deployed and in ways that are sometimes retrogressive to democracies. So what are you as companies actually doing? Do companies then say, because the laws in certain African states are very lax, so we will maximize on profits because basically nothing holds us to account? Or what basically is the position of these companies, especially when they are entering a terrain where there's very minimum regulation and most of those laws are very poorly formulated? Thank you.
Given that I've talked a lot, I think we're running out of time. Perhaps we can talk more about that out in the hallway, but I will say I agree with your sentiment, and I'll just end it with that.
But I think just one point which came up in a session first thing this morning is that clearly businesses, particularly those that are multinationals and are global corporations, then they can they should adopt standards that apply across the board. So that should benefit everybody globally. And just on the question of the involvement of business, it's worth knowing that a recent poll in the UK said that the UK population want the donation to businesses, a majority of them, of no more than £5,000 per year. That is what they expect businesses to be contributing to political campaigns, £5,000 a year.
Wow, fascinating. Okay, quickly, one sentence each. Piece of advice on building coalitions. One sentence.
I would say just listen and find the common values is the point there. That we'll leave it there. Listen.
I was going to say listen, but I'll also say stay curious.
Stay curious.
Go into it with your eyes open because there could be unintended consequences.
And on that note, thank you so much to our panelists. And we will, I know some of you are still eating dessert, but as quickly as possible, we'll move back into the main room. And we have a surprise award, surprise recipients that you'll all be hearing about in a few minutes. So please meet us back in the other room.